Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, hey everyone, thanks for jumping back in with us on the Kingdoms Podcast. I'm super thankful this morning to have with me Mike Jordan. Mike, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Some of you know Mike. He's the Dean of Chapel at Houghton College, somebody I had the privilege to share life in community with for a number of years back in the day, but somebody I also really respect for his walk with God and his wisdom and experience as a minister. So I know he's got a lot of rich things to share with us. But before we dive into that, I'm thinking, Mike, would you be able to give us a snapshot of some of the really formative experiences in your life? I'm thinking about some of the relationships that really drew you into a relationship with Christ, the experiences that kind of promoted in you a desire to say, I want to pursue a career in vocational ministry.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think it's fairly typical that ministers come either out of kind of a sudden faith conversion experience, or they just kind of grow up thinking the church is like home, and I care about the church enough that I want to kind of imagine being in church more. That's not every kid when they're a kid, but for me, that really was the kind of thing. I grew up in a little town of about 1,200 people or so, and a little church of about 150 people in that town. And it was always kind of a second home for me and my family. We were there pretty consistently. An American Baptist church, if you're familiar with different denominations. So it's we always talk about being kind of at the corner of the evangelical and mainline worlds. Like it's kind of probably the most conservative of the 7 mainline churches.
Yeah.
It's very, very congregational. And it was home to me. I have distinct kind of memories of, like, as a young kid, just feeling like, I can remember Sunday evening services, singing songs we would only sing on Sunday nights, and Wednesday youth groups that it just always kind of there. And, I think it's a mixed bag. I think there's certainly kind of emotional, kind of realities growing out of that, where I realized, like, I cared a lot about the adults in my church. Sometimes I cared too much, I think, in retrospect, about how the adults in my church were thinking about me. One of the things I've been like unpacking as a 40-something is like all the ways that I still connect God's approval with the approval of others. But that said, right, the approval of others just meant so much to me when I was a young person, and all these older people pouring into me and saying, like, we see you, we see the good things you're doing in school. We see you as having gifts for leadership, all that. So I also grew up with grandparents who taught at college. And for me, that was like something I always thought was, I kind of put on a pedestal. And it wasn't really till I got to seminary that I began to sort out, like, taking the kind of academics off the throne, as it were. Like, I was always like really intent on going into being a professor after when I was at college. It just felt like the right way to please the next adults in my life. And it wasn't until I got to seminary that I really began to unpack pastoral gifts that I had. And so I'm really glad that both of those things, in my role as dean of the chapel, I get to do some teaching, but some pastoring. So I'm glad to let those two different pieces of my of my being and my gifts. I'm glad to have a position where I can kind of live both of those out now. So yeah, I think those are formative. Seminary for me happened during 9/11 too.
Wow.
So, and that was also me beginning to unpack pastoral gifts, me realizing that, that I was able to not only provide people, intellectual leadership, but also that people were looking to me for comfort, for guidance in the middle of a really trying time. I went to seminary in Philadelphia, so to be right between New York and DC at that time was an interesting time. So I think that's also a time when I really began to unpack more pastoral gifts. So
yeah, that is very compelling, given how distinctly the United States was impacted by that experience. A lot of people point to that as being formative, but it speaks to the reality that maybe out of something really difficult and hard, um, really tragic, um, God can be working in people's lives to kind of propel them into something really good and restorative and redemptive. So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think for me, the key was at that point, like I saw a lot of people rushing that process. Like
yeah,
I saw a lot of Christians, and really the seminary I went to, it was not strictly conservative Christians who were behaving badly at that time. Just people who
yeah,
were ready to rush and say, like, this is what God means by this, pay attention. And I was
mm,
just like, I don't know that I'm ready to sort out what God means exactly
mm,
4 days after this cataclysmic event.
yeah,
There were
yeah,
people who were very sure it was the fault of this thing, this policy, this president, whatever. And I was just like, so anyway, I mean, I think yeah, I think you're right. Like God uses these things to sort of point things out in us, and I think
yeah,
sitting with it, let it sit on the stove for a little bit rather than try to cook
hmm,
it too fast is really important. But
yeah, 100%, man. Well, through your experiences, obviously in seminary, then going into pastoral ministry, now serving as the dean of chapel at Houghton College,
mhm.
obviously it's really important to you. It's in many ways your vocational role to invite people into not only a personal understanding of who God is, but into rhythms of life and worship that shape them spiritually, that form them in discovering and growing in God in deep and rich and vibrant ways. Unfortunately, I think often when people hear the word worship, we can tend to have a bit of a reduced understanding of what that means. We often just reduce it to singing songs. And I want to take a few minutes with you to delve into what worship looks like, what a life of worship looks like, but to give us kind of the 50,000-foot view to start. What does scripture mean when it talks about worship?
So just a little more personal background before jumping in there. So
Yeah.
like my graduate work that I did after seminary
Mm,
was about worship, and that was in
yeah.
part born out of the kind of question you're asking here.
Yeah.
So I graduated from seminary at 24. I started pastoring a local church then. And I was really kind of high-minded about it because I cared really deeply about lots of different things I was taking during seminary. So I'd be like in a New Testament class and think, I want to do a PhD in New Testament. And then I'd be in
Mm.
Old Testament class and be like, I want to do, and it's like, you can't do a bunch of PhDs. So for me, it was like, get out into the church, pastor, see what you feel like you need to study and what the church needs you to study. And
Mm,
for me, what I found in those years, like Luke, I was probably younger than you are now. Like I was 24, 25, 26, starting to pastor and realizing how often I was kind of skating by on charm, if that makes sense,
mm,
charm and youth and the room that people give young people. I mean, people don't give young people room to do everything, but they do give us room to do some kind of things.
yeah.
And so I was really struck with, like, I would be doing a funeral, for instance, right? And I'd be like scrambling to plan this thing. And I'd be like, there has got to be something more than just kind of my own inner barometer of what's right and wrong to do right now.
Mm,
There's got to be, I
yeah.
got to learn more about what this means and where it
Hmm.
came from. So that really
Hmm.
led me to study worship. And um, so that's kind of how I ended up doing my grad degree in worship. And I think for me, what's overwhelming in scripture is that there's not really a whole lot of direction, I
Mm,
think, for how the church is supposed to worship. There's a lot of, when we get to New Testament, kind of a presumption that the categories that are held in the Old Testament are going to hold over, right?
mhm.
And so there are a lot of prescriptions in the Old Testament about how to worship, but it's not really connected with, what you said in terms of like when we sing. And we often talk about singing as shorthand for the worship time, and then there's teaching or worship
Mhm.
and preaching. Um, and often what we mean by that is this kind of shorthand for this kind of like very personal, um, in some traditions ecstatic, and in some traditions contemplative, but this very personal feeling of connection
Yeah.
with God. And that just would not have been the guiding concern for the biblical writers.
Mm,
And it really wasn't the guiding concern of most of the church up until pretty recently. In the Old Testament, there really is more of a concern for worship and shared worship as the way that God's people cohered and the way that they demonstrated who they were to the world.
yeah.
And worship was a way of kind of engrafting you into a larger whole.
Yeah.
And so it really wasn't, in a sense, I mean, this would be provocative, but in a sense, it was the opposite of how we think about it now. It was less about kind of a personal one-on-one connection and more of a sense of I'm being grafted into a larger body.
Mhm.
And then, like I say, the New Testament sort of presumes that the early church is going to carry over, at least at the very beginning, right? When the church is primarily made up of Jewish people,
Yeah.
the presumption is they're going to do all the things Jews do to be Jews, which includes patterns of worship and public prayer. And it's not really until the church starts expanding that we kind of start thinking beyond that.
Yeah.
But even then, there's not a sense of like, you kind of do what's right for you, or you do the thing that makes you feel the close. There's a real reverence for form
Mm.
and what form does. I do think, like, another truism that we have about worship is that kind of, there's the timeless gospel that we pack into time-bound cultural forms.
Hmm.
And that, again, I don't want to say that that's completely without merit. There's a lot of truth in it, but the Bible doesn't really recognize that. I mean, what it means to be Jewish is bound up with the forms of being Jewish. And
Hmm.
initially, anyway, what it means to be Christian is bound up with forms of what it meant to be Jewish. And then it's bound up with certain other forms of what it meant to be Christian. Having this ritual meal together is very important early on. Baptizing is in some ways simple, but in all other ways, it's very prescribed what's going to be done at it. So
Hmm.
there's this real connection between form and content in worship, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a broad overview, but I think it pokes at some of our presuppositions about worship.
Yeah. And for me, I love it because it feels kind of like you're at the cusp of exploring a brand new country. And it's not just like one limited lane that you're in, but there's trails and mountain summits and valleys to discover and delve into. And so
Yeah,
I
and they're
love,
not all worthwhile. It's not like, does that make sense? Like, I mean, you can do some, like, when you begin to research the history of the early church and worship, they were doing some crazy things. And so
mm,
it's not like we can bring all those things in the present and say, everything's great, like there are some really, like, I was doing some research the other day for a thing I was writing, and I was looking at this 3rd century liturgy. And then people used to bring not just the bread for communion, but they used to bring other food too, to share
wow.
with everybody at a ritual meal and to take to the poor. And there was like this special blessing that was done over the cheese and the olives that people would bring. So the blessing for the cheese says something like, Lord, sanctify this milk which has been coagulated, and coagulate us to your love.
Wow.
I was like, I won't be doing this anytime soon in worship, but it's interesting to know that's part of our history, like,
Yeah, we're not going to reintroduce that one. We're going to let
yeah,
that be
courteous
time
God.
bound and stay in the past. Yeah,
That's right.
totally
That's right.
fair.
That's right.
Well, hey, when you think about kind of the scope of worship, and thanks so much for highlighting those things, but I know oftentimes when people think about the side of worship that does involve specifically singing and writing songs or liturgies, that a lot of the inspiration comes from the Psalms. People are often looking back, seeing what David or other psalmists wrote. And what I find really compelling, I know when I chew on and kind of wrestle with the Psalms is I think there's ways in which you see some themes from the Psalms really explicitly celebrated today in our liturgies and in our worship music, especially. And on the flip side, sometimes there's other themes that are quite central to the Psalms that we seem to bypass almost entirely. And so I'm wondering, what do you see as some of those themes from the Psalms that we are celebrating that are really good, that should be continued? But what are some of those themes that you say, hey, we're totally missing this, but this is part of holistic worship? What are some of the ways we could draw those themes into our worship in a way that empowers the church to have a more holistic approach to worship?
Yeah. So I think, Luke, when I was your age and younger, the way that people talked about the differences between like hymns and contemporary worship, those would be the language of that day. They often use the shorthand like hymns have just so much theology packed into them. And
Mm,
it was compared with these kind of like choruses that people sort of thought were kind of happy clappy and not a whole lot of ideas in it. Lord,
mm,
I lift your name on high, these kinds of
yeah,
things.
yeah.
And what's really interesting is that, in the last 20, 25, 30 years, songwriters have really caught up, right? I mean,
Mm,
the kind of density of the songs, I don't know, like I'm not a huge Hillsong guy, but the song that they did, was it 100 billion times or 100
yeah,
million times a few years ago? I mean, that's
yeah,
a dense song, that
yeah,
makes real claims about how God works in the world through science, blah, blah, blah.
yeah.
But people still use that kind of shorthand to sort of act like this music is not theologically
Mm,
full. It really is really rich. And in many ways, I mean, I think they do a good job. More modern music does a really good job at expressing reverence for God, at
mm,
creating an atmosphere that's reverent for God.
mhm,
Um, you know, uh, and kind of making aware that God is concerned about what's going on inside of us.
mhm,
I mean, when I hear songs today use the language of God is for us so frequently,
yeah,
I'm really encouraged by that language. I mean, I know how easy it is for people to mishear that, right? And people think that it means that God just loves everything about me and is happy with whatever I'm doing at the moment. That's not what it means, of course, but I'm glad to hear that this kind of idea that God is really aware of the inner terrain of our lives.
Hmm.
I could deal with a little more God is concerned with what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And that's hard. I think in part, it's in part due to the conversation we just had, Luke, where it's like the even the content, even when the content of the music is kind of on point that way, sometimes the form of music, the way
Mm.
it's done now, really kind of explicitly assumes this kind of one-on-one kind of ecstatic connection where I close my eyes, I shut others out, in order to connect with God. And even if what's being said between me and God is more and more accurate, there's still a way that it really isolates us
Mm.
from each other and maybe from the problems of the world around us. And so, like I think, for instance, as I look back on the hymns that I grew up with, what's helpful for me in them is actually not the theology that was taught in them, but
Mm.
the way that they stuck and engrafted me into a larger people, so that those
Mm.
songs are still songs that I carry around inside me today.
Yeah.
But we don't presume that worship music will do that anymore. And it's a little sad. Like when I'm
Mm.
singing with, Luke, I mean, the songs that we would have sung when you were a student at Houghton now
Mhm.
are songs that are sung either ironically or not at all by
Mm.
people now.
Yeah.
Like when we go back and sing Oceans, for instance, it sounds like to current students, like we're kind of throwing it back to middle school.
Mm.
Like we
Yeah.
expect that these songs will follow the trajectory of pop music, where they'll be popular for a time, they will age, then they'll
Mhm.
be popular with 30 somethings and dads, and then
Yeah.
and that's a lot to carry around with something that's deeply precious to you
Yeah.
about a connection with God, as opposed to saying there's something in this that really is timeless. And that's something I would really love to see recaptured. I mean, the Psalms are, um, in most monastic communities, the Psalms are ritually chanted once a week, the entire Psalter,
Yeah.
as a way of sort of saying, this is our book, this is who we are. Even the weird parts of it,
Mhm.
even the parts that are really challenging, even the parts where the psalmist seems kind of adolescent. I mean,
Mm.
that's part of who we are. And so that's the thing that I fear most getting lost, as opposed to like content, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's fair. That's fair. To to maybe zoom in a bit when you
Sure, yeah,
consider rhythms of life and faith.
yeah,
I know that something you care a lot about in your role at Houghton is inviting students into daily rhythms of coming together to pray, to encourage one another,
yeah.
and I see that as so valuable. And oftentimes, I mean, the concern of pastors and others in ministry often is that people will see that place of connecting with God, following God, as kind of isolated to Sunday,
Yeah.
and not always value the day by day rhythms of really purposefully engaging in a relationship with God that is marked by really rhythms of worship. And so I wonder, on just a really practical front, for listeners who might be saying, what could this look like
Mhm.
in my everyday life? On a Wednesday, what does it mean to be a person of worship as a follower of Jesus? What would be some insights or advice you give us on that front?
Yeah. So, I mean, the church historically, as it's thought about time, has tried to think about sanctifying not only the week, like you're talking about, we sanctify the week. We sort of say there's a special day of the week.
Mm.
But the church historically has found creative ways to sanctify the day and
Mm.
sanctify the year,
Mm.
so that the year kind of follows a rhythm of retelling the story of Christ's birth, uh, teaching, ministry, death, resurrection, coming of the
Yeah.
Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
anointing of the church, just as a way of kind of like holding that story underneath us at all times, so that it's
Mhm.
something we carry around and retell and retell and retell. Same way with the day. I mean, and this grew out of the practice of Jewish daily prayer, but that idea of like gathering several times a day for prayer is something that, frankly, Luke, has never made sense to Houghton students when they come in.
Mm.
Like it's not something that people immediately gravitate to, in part because it lacks all the trappings of the kinds of worship which we've just talked about.
Mhm.
I don't aim at making it a time where we necessarily are walking through the kind of ecstatic experience
Mhm.
or one-on-one, but more a sense of, um, we build a habit of encountering God at certain times, so that it becomes natural
Yeah.
and expected that God's going to speak to us.
Yeah.
Often my way of describing this is that I do the New York Times daily crossword puzzle
Mm.
every day,
Yeah.
and uh, there's a little streak thing on it. They kind of gamify it. So if you do it on the day it comes out, like you can build your streak. And so right now my streak is at 1,370 days in a
Right
row
on.
that I've done this, and that's it comes out at 10 o'clock the day before, and you have to do it between 10 o'clock at night the day before and midnight the day of.
Mm,
So you have that 26-hour window. So for me, every night at 10 o'clock is like crossword time now.
mm,
Like I just begin to sense like the clock's going to 9:30, 9:45, time for crosswords. And that's just a matter of having done that every day for 1,370 days in a
yeah,
row.
yeah,
And likewise, I mean, if we talk about wanting to develop this hunger for God, if we want to develop a hunger for something, you have to build a pattern where you come to expect it,
yeah,
and you begin to miss it if it's not there. But if you
right.
can't, it often means cracking through some of the difficult things in establishing a habit,
Mm,
right? Like, I mean, you do something that you know you should do, and the first couple times it feels great.
mm,
Then it feels difficult or boring or
mm,
repetitive, and so you just sort of say, "Well, I'll put this aside," and that's fine for a lot of things in our lives. But we really have to kind of break through that if we want to change patterns in our lives and habits. And so that's how I understand the role of and frankly, it's one of the reasons, like as I kind of conceptualize what a Christian college is,
yeah,
that's part of it. Like we have the freedom to do that in a way because we have a group of people who have built their lives together for a season in a way that's just not, it's probably not the case in your church, Luke. I can't imagine that you have people who live on site there with
yeah,
you, and
no, yeah,
like that's just not a reality. And so it gives us a chance to do that and come alongside the local church and kind of have a daily piece that we kind of help students learn. So
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And with that, do you ever find part of inviting people into those spaces that maybe look a little bit different from those maybe ecstatic experiences they're expecting, that part of that is almost calling people's hearts and minds to a place of seeing the subtle but sacred beauty that exists in those spaces? What I mean by that is one of the things I find myself competing against sometimes, if you will,
mhm.
is wanting to call people's attention away from a very shallow, easily digestible, especially social media things that can demand their attention, and almost for a moment temporarily sate this desire for intrigue or
Yeah.
even a sense of connection or what have you, and say, like, join us in this, in slowing down and pausing and gathering to prayer, or gathering to read through this liturgy, or gathering to sing a hymn a cappella, and look to you. You're going to have to stretch yourself. You're going to have to maybe see with new eyes, but to
Mhm.
drink in the deep, rich, and maybe sometimes subtle but profound beauty of the spiritual moment. Do you ever find that in your own experiences?
Yeah, and the real, I think, aha moment comes for people when something that they've been repeating ritually and not always feeling comes to mind at a moment when they need it that's not in the middle of that, right? I mean, that's the idea, is
Mm,
you're kind of etching something
yeah.
on your heart, etching something on your life that really is useful. I mean, we don't just do this to kind of, you know, repeat stuff, but
Mm,
we do this because we believe that the things that we're saying to God and saying aloud to ourselves are things that are good to have in our hearts when we go into those really tense spaces. And
yeah.
often when we go into those really tense spaces, like I say, when I was a younger person, I found myself kind of relying on charm and gifts as opposed to really God's spirit in me.
Yeah.
And I'll say this, Luke, like, I mean, that challenge of calling people out of that, it's easier at the age I am now. Like, I feel like the age in which you knew me and the age that you are now, you're kind of that cool uncle who sometimes, like coming alongside people and you're not always like the dad, right? It
Mm,
becomes easier. Like now I'm really closer to the age of the father of most students,
mhm.
and they expect something different from their dad. They don't expect their dad to do something exciting. And so
Okay.
that's, does that make sense? Like, and dads, and I take a lot of this from Henry Nouwen's reading of the Prodigal Son,
Yeah.
like dads are there to kind of keep the fires burning, to keep the lights on. That he'll have the phone close by if you're in a spot and need him. But dads are supposed to be responsible
Mm,
and not needing to be exciting. And I've appreciated that about, like, I'm 43 now, so I've been appreciating that about this stage of my life,
yeah.
that students don't expect me to be cool anymore, and that's good for me. Like it saves us one disappointment anyway when they find out I'm not. So
Mm, mm. And in some ways too, and I appreciate your honesty in that, because then in some ways too, like I long for that in some ways, that place of saying, like, just being, of honestly saying, like, please don't in any way look to be impressed with me
yeah.
or enamored and following me. That's not why I'm here. Even though
Mhm.
there's definitely times a part of my heart is like, hey, follow me.
Yeah,
Um,
yep.
But yeah, to be able to say, like, be delighted in who God is. And yeah, sometimes, as you say, as life changes and different seasons emerge,
Sure, it'll
it
come with gray hair, man.
yeah,
So
it
you'll
takes you to
get
the
there.
place of just being able to say, hey, the best I really want you to see is just who Jesus is. So
Yep.
all good thoughts, all good thoughts. Now, I know in some of our correspondence, you've touched on thinking about worship specifically in the ways in which it can be restorative,
Mm,
being a
mm,
healing agent. And obviously, we're kind of hopefully coming out of a pandemic.
mm.
But even if we hadn't been in a situation where external circumstances are demanding on some level, pretty much for everybody worldwide, everyone has their own unique internal pain. And so, in the face of adverse external circumstances or internal pain, is it possible for worship to really be an agent that heals and restores? And if so, how?
Yeah. Well, I think I think it's really important to say that there are still, and this is despite the fact that so much of the church movement in the last 50 years has been about helping visitors to be comfortable, right? Like that's something
Mm,
that's just kind of ingrained in our way of doing things now. But there are still profound unwritten rules around church that are not immediately understandable for people who are visiting our church for the first time.
mm,
And they're not things like, when do I stand? When do I kneel? Like we've solved a lot of those things in churches like ours.
mhm,
We've given people stadium seating, which gives them an armrest on either side so that they can feel cultural distant. Like we've met
mm,
all those kinds of felt needs that people have had to kind of feel comfortable in a space. But what I mean, like, and I do think the pandemic has really brought some of these things to the surface, right? But like, what can I and can't I talk about here? that's a really that's a really difficult question, especially for a generation that tends to be quite activist, in
yeah,
many ways.
yeah,
Like, what am I allowed to say here? And what if I say it? It's not that I need people to agree with everything that I say, mind you, but just like, what if I say it? Am I going to throw the whole system into a tizzy? Like,
yeah.
if I say, if I wear my Black Lives Matter T-shirt to your church, what will happen?
Mhm,
will people say hello to me? Will they greet me? Will they ask about it? Will they want to know why this is important to me? Or will it be quite evidently divisive in your church?
yeah,
And so to kind of get through this moment, your church will just kind of not acknowledge that it's there.
mm,
That's one example. We could talk about
yeah,
lots of examples like this.
yeah,
And this, I think, makes an anxious generation even more anxious. Like, I mean,
yeah,
anxiety is primarily about when your outer world and your inner world are not aligned,
yeah,
right? And so we expect that somehow we're going to bring people into church who are not part of church
mm,
and introduce them to a God who loves them. And yet we're going to be profoundly uncomfortable when they're out front about things that feel important to their identity. And
mm,
again, I want to be really clear. It's not about sort of saying, yes, you're fine as you are, right? Like part of what churches like ours often fall back on is to say, no, God's here to transform you, and that's fine.
yeah,
But there has to be this kind of like tacit, um, the realization that having you here, even with the things that might make you complicated in the life of our church, it's still an inestimable pleasure to have you here and worship
yeah,
with us.
yeah,
And so those are, I think the kinds of things which pastors need to be aware of as
mhm,
they're thinking about what sermon topics to share, for instance, when they're thinking about the language that they use around the communion table,
yeah,
the particular ways that we welcome people or exclude people based
mm,
on the things that we say.
yeah,
And it's, again, I think so many evangelicals, people like us, we tend to have, we get really nervous around that language of kind of welcome and inclusion because we don't know, like, we don't want to say everything is right that people are bringing. And I completely understand this, but that sense of, am I willing even to recognize that in myself so
yeah,
that I can be clear that this is a place for transformation, that
yeah,
that even
yeah,
I am clear about the things that are inconvenient about me to this community as
yeah,
I'm learning and growing and being transformed. So all of these
yeah,
things I think are really important to the church being a healing place. And the pandemic has really heightened everybody's stress level,
yeah,
so that those things which I think before would not have tripped triggers in the evangelical world really trip those triggers more easily. We're
yeah,
less inclined to sort of, and this is remarkable because I don't think we were that well inclined to do this before the pandemic, but certainly during the pandemic, outsiders have become understood as more threatening to us than
mm,
I don't think it's tenable for the church to go on always thinking of outsiders as threats. Like,
Yeah.
we have to be able to say, you're welcome here
Yeah.
as you are, and we're all growing. And
Yeah.
so what it looks like to grow here with us. But I just feel really keenly there are all kinds of ways that we kind of encode a kind of don't say this,
Mm.
um, or don't, this is the line, you can't talk past this line. Whatever you do, like, don't do that, because it's going to bother us to a way
Mm.
that we won't, it'll grieve us so much.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
does that make sense?
It does. And how it's very compelling when, at least in my mind, when you see a follower of Jesus readily enter into what you might describe as like that gray space,
Right.
kind of that messy in between, and say, I may be quote unquote, fluent in Christianese or in this specific Christian community, and yet I know there's gray spaces in my own life, as you
Right.
said, that are still in process. And so I want to humbly and gently and respectfully enter into the gray spaces in your life,
Yeah.
even though they might look quite different from mine, realizing that there's ways that I can grow and be formed in that. I mean, I guess a quick question would be, how do you do that with people? How do you enter into those gray spaces with people?
Yeah. Well, what I'm thinking about primarily in worship
Yeah.
is kind of ritualizing those gray spaces out loud, right?
Mhm.
I think what happens is we talk about, we say things like, church is welcome to everybody. But then when, like, I don't know, we think about, for example, there's a guy whose ministry I really admire in the Anglican world named Peter Volk. And
Yeah.
he does,
Peter's been on the podcast.
Peter's been on this podcast.
Yeah.
I'm honored to sit in the virtual chair where Peter has sat. So,
Summer 2021. He's a beauty.
oh, that's
Anyways,
great.
yeah,
So
continue.
I admire Peter's work, right?
Mm.
But Peter's work really challenges, right? Like, there
Yes.
are people to Peter's right who say Peter shouldn't talk about himself as gay, right?
Yeah.
And there are people to Peter's left who say Peter should embrace this aspect of his identity and enter into feel free at least to enter into a relationship with another
Mm-hmm.
man. I'm primarily thinking about how there have been many people I've known who have been in Peter's place, who have either identified themselves as gay or same-sex attracted, right? But when they go to a local church, one that has a biblical sexual ethic like Houghton would hold, and I think like your church would hold,
Mm-hmm.
and when they start sharing that story out loud, then they feel zoomed in on, right? And it's
Mm.
like everything, like if I come to church with another guy, the question is like, is this just a friend? And
Right.
and are they too close of friends? And all of a sudden it becomes everybody's business what sort of person you are. And so because of that, many gay people think, I
Yeah.
can't do this with my life. I can't come in and be micromanaged in this way. I can't have.
Yeah.
So I think, for example, pastors who are unafraid to kind of use language that explicitly welcomes gay people to the table without sort
Yes.
of saying, without sacrificing a perspective of what it is, but sort of saying, this is how we're going to enter into this gray space.
Yeah.
But many pastors are afraid to do that because they know that it will seem right. There are people to the right that will
Mm.
couch that language as divisive because it makes them uncomfortable that they've chosen it.
Yeah.
And I get that. Like, and I don't want to be needlessly divisive, but at the same time, we have to realize that not saying something like that also brings division. It's just hidden division. It's division
Yeah.
that we don't have to feel
Yeah.
out loud. And so sermon topics particularly are chosen this way. And then again, like I say, language about how we welcome.
Mm.
And who are the examples that we're talking about in sermons? Who are the people that we platform? Who are the people who get to make decisions?
Yeah.
All of these things. Choosing people who are definitely in agreement with the core values of our church,
Mm.
but also choosing people who may be inconvenient to some people.
Yeah.
To say, this church is a safe place for inconvenient people. For us, the cost of welcoming you is worth the cost it's going to have to do us. The benefit of receiving you is going to be worth the cost we have to pay of like learning about who you are and
Mm.
dealing with our own grief that things are harder to deal with than they were before.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many ways that churches, I think, kind of center their own frustration at these things rather than really think creatively. How can we work together to be as welcoming as we're allowed to be
Yeah.
within the parameters of our core values, not even
Yeah.
pushing our core values at all, but that's really hard work.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and it's work that, again, it's work that often we get couched as divisive if we do, because it pains people to do it, and some people might leave. So
Yeah.
I think that's part of the challenge. So Peter can talk
Yeah.
about that more.
Yeah. Well, considering core values, if the cross is ultimately a victory of self-giving love, then what does it mean for us to be called into those spaces of self-giving love in response to that? So yeah. And hey, if you're listening, you just jumped in. Yeah, it's episode 36 of the Kingdoms podcast. Peter Valk came on, and yeah, a very wise, humble, courageous individual with some really good things to say.
Yeah.
Uh, we've kind of touched on this in just this last question a little bit, but I wonder if you could still speak to, when we think about cultural formation.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different ways in which I think, especially for this next generation, maybe millennials too, but also Gen Z, there's a sense sometimes like, maybe I love following Jesus and I see God's word as sacred and I value the rhythms of my faith community, but it is almost impossible to understand how those realities can be interwoven with my presence in culture, can be allow me to actually engage with my culture in a life-giving way that still holds true to the core values as we talked about that I have, yet still inviting people in a way almost to see in my life a spiritual aesthetic that celebrates life in God, not only as true, but as good and as beautiful and as worthy of pursuit. And so when you think about worship and cultural engagement, what does that look like?
Mm. Yeah, I think we're reaping some of the consequences of culture war language sneaking into the church. And I don't mean that there aren't, again, this always feels kind of dangerous. So I want to acknowledge, right, there is battle imagery in the scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways in which we are engaged in a conflict at all times. And yet I feel like Christians who are only capable of seeing the world through a conflictual lens,
Mm-hmm.
that question of like, it's almost tribal in the sense of
Mm-hmm.
what you're talking about here is this theoretical student who like wants to go and love people well. Here's one idea of how to do that at school and one idea at church, and often feels very caught, not necessarily between ideas, but between people that they care about who are
Mm-hmm.
prescribing these different things. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah.
Like, at least I don't think of it so much as a contest of ideas or a battle of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
When I meet young people who are in the same place that you're talking about here, I'm thinking about people who are not so much needing further illustration of why biblical ideas are correct,
Mm-hmm.
but they need to see it kind of modeled out that gracious engagement is possible.
Yes.
So the question of like, I mean, some of the things we've just been raising are really important. How does your church model gracious engagement with people who come in who are challenging, whatever that looks like?
Yeah.
Is it quite evident that the person, and we can take the language off of culture war kinds of issues, and we can think about just, does my church welcome poor people well? Or when a
Mm-hmm.
poor person comes into our church, do they stand out and everybody doesn't know quite what to do? And it's quite evident that we just kind of wish that person would leave so that we could kind of go back to being us without worrying about what to do. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, people notice that sort of thing. And so I think people are looking for models of people who are living this out. And so, I hope it would inflect our ministry, which is in part worship, but in part other places as well,
Yeah.
where people can find in us trusted role models. And again, it's formed by those essential habits, right?
Yeah.
Part of the drilling down and again and again and again coming into God's presence is about reassuring yourself at a really deep level. God's really here with me. And
Yeah.
so I don't need to be afraid to go out and
Mm.
speak the truth as I understand it, listen really humbly for the truth as other people understand it, weigh things well because I care about truth more than I care about being patted on the back that I'm already right. I
Mm.
mean, these are the kinds of things that have a deep spiritual security component. And that's the kind of stuff that we learn
Yeah.
in the rhythms of worship, because we learn God really is there. He's reliably there for us, for me, and not just in those moments when I, have a band to lead me, and I have an ecstatic moment that's kind
Yeah.
of helped along by everything that we can help along an ecstatic moment.
Mm.
But that God's really there in the ordinary times,
Yeah.
reassures us of that. So
Yeah.
that's how I
And
think about it.
sometimes, yeah. And sometimes I think our faith becomes most alive when we take all those rich things that we've enjoyed in those spaces of intimacy or quiet or faith community and say,
Mhm.
how can I live in this reality in the presence of people who are yet to maybe discover how good it could be?
Yeah.
And on the flip side, discover that there's really good things God's doing in and through their lives. even if they've yet to discover a personal relationship with Jesus, that I can be challenged or enriched or formed by. So yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
those thoughts. To
Yeah.
maybe pivot as we reach the end of our conversation together, but a few more things I'd love to hear insights on is, you serve, as we've talked about, you're the dean of chapel at what is a Wesleyan school, but it's a very diverse student populace. There's multiple denominations represented. There's a lot of different worldviews. You have people on the far left, even people on the far right, and kind of everything in between. And so, as a faith leader in
Mhm.
that community, how do you really foster unity in such an environment?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, there's obviously a limited kind of creedal agreement that comes with being a professor and a faculty or staff person at
Hmm.
Houghton. So we are Christians, the faculty and staff who are there, and most students are, right. Not all students, but most are. Houghton doesn't require students to sign a faith commitment, so we do have some students who aren't Christian. Um, but there's largely kind of a Christian vibe going on, and there is a special respect and privilege for the Wesleyan way of being Christian. Um, and I say it that way because it's not just a matter of beliefs, but it's also kind of a way, a way of being. And certainly the theology and Bible faculty represent more of the Wesleyan perspective, and the rest of the campus has a little more of a ecumenical vibe to it, right? But I think for me, what's really crucial is like being able to demonstrate. I think, and I kind of alluded this to before, part of the ministry of what a Christian college can bring a denomination, particularly, is that we can come alongside what local churches do and create a space that complements what local churches do without trying to repeat it.
Mm,
And so I don't have to have my parishioners be Wesleyan
right.
at because it's this pseudo churchy space, right? Um, so, but neither is it possible in a local Wesleyan church to have this kind of ecumenical community that's supported by a Wesleyan perspective.
Hmm.
So there are times, right, where that cuts sharp, and it sometimes cuts the left sharp, and sometimes cuts people to the right sharp. I think it's probably more evident the ways that it cuts the left, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I think Houghton, all things considered, is still an evangelical and more conservative school
Hmm.
in many ways. And so there are points of tension, I think, with folks who are on the far left, whatever that means, kind of theologically, not so much politically. But there are times too where we take on people who are to the right, and we sort of, we insist, for example, that in our chapel we will have women speak in the pulpit, and that students will be expected to be there and respectfully listen, even if that's not part of their tradition.
Hmm.
So, it doesn't come from saying, all I'm trying to do is to say it's not so much of a everybody's fine, we respect everybody's position. No, we have a way that we're trying to live out in front of you, but
Yeah.
we're also trying to say there's a much more elastic kind of hospitality that we can practice than I would
Yeah.
if I were a local church pastor. And we're
Yeah.
much more responsible for all of the kind of shepherding and formation and protecting you from like wrong idea. I mean, that
Yeah.
there's a different kind of pastor that I'm privileged with being. And I
Yeah.
think there's got to be a lot more, you didn't ask me on to talk about this, but I mean, reflecting on what the task of Christian higher ed is really important right now.
Yeah.
And for me, that's a comfortable spot for it. It's not a space to just come in and be protected from everything going on out there. That wouldn't be a healthy way to think of it. But I do think of it as kind of like an alternative community that comes alongside the church, serves the church, and is served by the church, but
Mm.
it demonstrates a different kind of way that's of engagement with cultural issues that's really possible, that maybe the Wesleyan church wouldn't see as clearly if we weren't doing it the way that we're doing it.
Right.
So that's
Right.
kind of how I process it. I'm sure there are ways in which Houghton's Wesleyanness seemed odd to you while you were there as a student. I mean, things you had to maybe encounter that were a little different than what you had grown up with. And hopefully that's a good, fruitful thing. The tension can lead to something fruitful. So,
I loved it actually growing up in partially growing up in an interdenominational mission where
mhm,
there's a little bit of everything represented.
mhm,
That quality at Houghton with being able to worship with a Catholic friend beside me on one side and a charismatic on the other.
mhm,
I really love that, and there are
mhm,
definitely new things that I learned, but it made me. I think it kind of gave me a real longing for that
mhm,
elasticity of community that you talk about
yeah,
in I think a good way. So
mhm,
just a few more things to touch base with you on, but you mentioned this a moment ago, but really, being this community that's growing in the right ways and healthy in the right ways, and we're a lot of our listeners are in places where, whether it's in their personal life, their families, their business, or their broader community, they're in a season of rebuild, or maybe they're just in a season of treading water, trying to grapple with the reality of what the last year and a half has cost them, maybe what's been lost, the toll it's taken on them personally or people in their lives. And as a faith leader that's guiding a student body out of this pandemic, what would you say are some of those core ingredients that not only students, but really everyone is longing for? This is what's needed to rebuild a healthy community. What can we pursue to do that, to recover and to be restored?
Yeah. So I'm doing a sermon series kind of along these lines this semester at Houghton. We're calling it Don't Call It a Comeback, based on the LL Cool J song Mama Said Knock You Out from the early 90s. But it starts with LL Cool J saying, don't call it a comeback. And part of that is like recognizing we don't really want to go back to what was before. And so I think the first thing that has to come here is to be appreciative of the church that was pre-COVID, but also to acknowledge that was not a perfect church.
Yeah.
And so just trying to go back to what that was, we're missing a moment to do something new and
Yeah.
to do something that builds on that in a healthy way. The three elements that I think are most important that I'm kind of building the series around are truth, grace, and forgiveness. And I think there's a temptation to lose all three of those right now.
Yeah.
There's a temptation because of the way that churches are really, I mean, it's so unclear as to what the future of the residential church is like. And so there's this sense of like, I don't want to offend anybody right now by wading into difficult things. Nobody can stand controversy right now. And I get that. Like, I don't want to be needlessly controversial. Yet at the same time, we really can't give up on the idea of truth.
Yeah.
And it's hard, right? Like right now, I think one of the things that's really polarizing communities is in America, and I don't know quite how it's in Canada, but the COVID vaccine is really polarizing rural American communities in many ways.
Yeah.
And so I don't want us to be at a place where we sort of say, well, you think what you want, I think what I want, all opinions are equal. No, I don't think all opinions are equal. Now, it's not to say that I'm always right, but for me to say all opinions are equal is for me to sort of tap out of a conversation that's really important right now.
Yeah.
That we want to, as Christians, I think, get it right.
Yeah.
And we want each other's best wisdom as we're learning about getting it right, which means speaking the truth as clearly as we can. It means, again, humbly receiving the truth that other people have to give us, but truth really has to be a key component. Grace also feels more optional right now. Like it just feels like I can't be nice to this person who's out of control. And I mean, grace really gets at it's the flip side of the truth piece. It's why am I saying this? Am I compulsively speaking because I feel a need to speak, or am I really saying something that I believe to be true for the good of the body? That's a key. And if I can't sort that out in myself, it's problematic. Forgiveness is going to be the real one, Luke. I mean, I think that's something that we're just beginning to feel now. But like, I don't know, within the faith communities I'm attached to, within the Wesleyan Church, broader evangelical world, like as I watch what the pandemic is doing right now, and how the sides are getting more and more written in stone, and frankly, as I watch people die. I mean, I've got like a lot of people I know now. I've lost 2 Facebook friends, another in ICU, and it like, and most around the issue of vaccine. Like, I mean, again, I don't even know how you process this personally or your church processes this, but for me, like the people that I know that are suffering disproportionately with this are not vaccinated. And yet the very hard, like what happens now, right? Like what happens as that rips through the American South? What happens as that rips through a certain kind of faith community and they've lost folks? How do we rebuild in a way that is honest about what has happened and gracious and extends like that we're really there for each other? Like for those of us who are more of in a pro-vaccine camp right now, when I watch my anti-vax friends suffer, I don't even know how to come alongside and love them, because it will feel like, to them, it will feel demeaning, it will feel condescending, it'll feel like I'm rubbing it in, and that not it at all. I don't I don't mean this, I feel kind of paralyzed
Yeah.
with how we really do this in a way that genuinely loves, right? And it's
Yeah.
not just about, well, my side is going to win.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
does that make sense? Like
It
that
does.
to me is so murky. And I feel like we're just at the very beginning of this wave cresting. Like, what does it mean to go forward together and be a church when we really have been divided about this? That's going to be really, really hard.
Yeah. And so forgiveness is key. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, whatever it looks like, I just being able to sort of stand in that place where we say, yeah, I graciously accept the forgiveness that others extend me.
Mm.
And I extend forgiveness wherever I can. As we try to build, just people are so bruised and so
Mm.
hurt. And just when we throw death and suffering into the mix, I mean, it just, the ways that this is going to be a traumatic event for the church are things which I'm sure are not going to get unpacked fully in the course of my own ministry.
Mm.
If I have 25 more years, 30 more years of ministry left in me, I don't
Yeah.
think we're going to have this sorted out by then. I think
Wow.
that's a long-term process of like learning to forgive and be together again. It's just going to take a long time. I'm glad to be part of it because I think I have gifts in that area.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I understand now a little more of what I can contribute as a pastor, maybe even than I did before the pandemic.
Mm.
But boy, it's just the enormity of the task of forgiveness is going to be really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's where, maybe to bring it full circle, the reality of being a people who understand the rhythms of a life of worship, of being
Sure.
forgiven and forgiving,
Yeah.
uh, shapes us in the best ways to be those agents at this
You
cultural
ritualize that every
moment.
day and you begin to experience that as a
Yeah.
reality that you can rely on, that other
Yeah.
people might not be able to feel, but you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
So,
That leads the way forward redemptively. Yeah.
yep.
Really, really insightful. Well, hey, thank you so much. This has been really valuable, and I've learned a lot from you,
Thanks.
and I know our listeners will learn a lot from you. But where could people who are interested maybe learn more about what you do, or get connected, or yeah, discover more about what you're part of at Houghton?
Sure. Well, I'm always glad for people to look at Houghton. So you can certainly find us on the web at houghton.edu. I'm always glad for people who want to follow me personally too on Facebook. I don't do much with Twitter. I've I've really struggled, Luke, with like how much to involve myself in the world of social media. And I've figured less is better than more for me. So
Hmm.
right now I'm still kind of Facebook centric, but you can find me at Rev Dr. Michael Jordan on Facebook if you want to find me there. Or Houghton College Chapel on Facebook. We have a lot of the people, like you can see podcasts that we do that are very similar to this,
Hmm.
Luke, if you're at Houghton College Chapel, and we have guests that I'm always excited about doing the interviewing for. So
Yeah.
it's an unusual, like this is a rare occasion for me to be interviewed rather than the interviewer, but people that we're trying to bring in front of our community and say, hey, pay attention to these people as we're trying to
Yeah.
rebuild together. And I think you'd find a lot of overlap with the folks who are on your podcast. I mean, the kinds of people that are on, you might have some similar guests, even some of the same guests,
Yeah.
but some similar kind of spirit, and would be really glad if folks who connect with your podcast may connect with that kind of work too. So glad to have you follow us at Houghton College Chapel as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, man. Well, hey, thank you so much for this time today and everything you've shared. We're better for it.
Thanks, man. It was great.